Hello everyone, and welcome to another wonderful episode of Faffing with Friends. Today is a very special episode. I am joined by my two lovely students over here.
Lawrence.
And Joe.
And today, I am going to be making an absolute fool of myself. Because today, we're going to be discussing history, the collective memory of the world, and I actually happen to have a degree in history, so anything I say here can and will probably be used against me by these two and by anyone else who is listening. So, boys, let's hear your favorite historical periods, please.
Okay, let me set some context up first. Much like our fantasy episode, this is a thought experiment of if we could go to any historical period that we want to see in all of history, without any of the adverse effects, at least for the first part of the conversation, which ones would we go to and why? What do we want to see? Why do we want to see these things? Etc., etc. So does that set the grounds for everyone?
Yep.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, who wants to start?
I literally just told you to start. Go. Listen to your teacher. Go.
Oh, God, I'm being attacked. I'm being abused. Send the cops. Help.
Herodotus, don't kill me. Okay, so my favorite period of all time has to be the medieval era. I don't know what it is from a young age. It must have been when in year 3 we went to a castle. It might have been Pontefract Castle, because I used to live back in Sheffield. We were closer to Pontefract. And we went underground to the dungeons, and there was a suit of armor there, obviously on display for the kids. And I was just so obsessed. And I remember my school teacher, Mrs. Richardson, she loved that I loved history. So she basically indulged me with a lot of history books when we went back to school the week after. And I think that's what really sparked it until I started playing Medieval Total War. So we're going back to what we talked about before. All of these historical video games, yes. Video games have done more for me than academics have done. Sorry, academics. So these were really what there was a renaissance of interest for me in history because of these video games. So it started with Medieval Total War, then it was the Stronghold series, then it was the Assassin's Creed series. And ever since then, I always go back to them because I'm poor and I can't afford anything new. And I'll replay them and I'll just enjoy them. And it makes me want to just think about those historical periods, learn more about them, and usually I'll have a podcast playing in the background. And then for the past 9 years, it's been Crusader Kings 2 that I've been playing that's been having that influence on me.
Okay, so what about the medieval period makes you want to go back to see it?
Not so much living there, because I'd probably end up being unless I was omniscient and omnipresent, I'd probably end up being a peasant. And they didn't have the best of lives. But it was the way that the society was progressing. So on the one hand, you had the whole socio-political, economic side of it, with the kings warring each other and expanding and so on, within Europe and outside of Europe. But then you also had the scientific, the rise of science at the time. You had the mini Renaissance. You had the monks and the scribes, writing all of these books or transcribing them. So kind of like Ivaylo's been doing for our podcast episodes recently. And what that really led to, even though at the time you didn't have much technological advances, the fact that period was capable of, obviously you've got the ancient Egyptians, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point, where they built pyramids. But on the other hand, you've got medieval England, the Normans, who built these amazing castles, these defensive forts to not only prevent other invaders from taking what they'd taken over, but preventing rebellions and so on. It's just a way. I remember, because, all right, I'll share this real quick and I'll give it back to you guys. We were in year 5 or year 6. And we went to this Anglo-Saxon village. It was a reenactment village, and it was basically like a educational trip. And they made us into the soldiers, and they gave me a pike, right? And we had a commander, and he was teaching us how to use the pikes. Obviously, the pikes had like a leather sheath on them, so we didn't accidentally poke someone. So, well, what ended up happening was I accidentally poked the guy who was training us, in the backside, and that was the whole thing. And then it told us about how the peasants lived, who the reeves were, and the hierarchy, basically. And that just really sparked an interest. When I was playing Medieval Total War, that was really what I was thinking about. And I was listening to like medieval music or medieval inspired music and medieval podcasts. And I was just really putting myself in that era. It was cool to play a king, but I don't want to be a peasant, basically. It's a botched way of saying it, but that's That's a short way of saying it.
I'm not really the hugest fan of the medieval period, although I know quite a lot about it. It was never something that really quite connected with me. The only thing that I do love from the medieval period that connected with me 100% was knighthood and chivalry. Knighthood and chivalry was a driving point of the period. I actually did one of my modules in history was knighthood and chivalry. It was led by none other than Dr. Tom Asbridge, who is a famous,
the Crusades.
Yeah, the Crusades. He's a famous British historian. He's done shows for the BBC. He's written tons of books on William Marshall. He's just a very strong authority figure in that period. And for me, that whole knighthood and chivalry idea was very appealing to me. You have all these traditional stories of how knights were these symbols of justice, these symbols of honor, and how they would go and fight off into battle. Some of them were obviously over-exaggerated, and others were quite undermining of their achievements. But for me, knighthood and chivalry was a defining part of the medieval periods. Fun fact, if I can share an anecdote myself, me and Thomas Hasbridge and the whole class, we all went to a exhibition of armor, like a knighthood armor stuff, and Asbridge actually told us that he actually owns
he has a suit of armor, yes,
which costs him around £5,000 a month just to polish. So
that's crazy.
It's quite a huge investment if you want to get mementos from that era. But again, also, have any of you ever done any reenactments of stuff like that? I mean, Joe, you mentioned something, but
Yeah, if I can quickly add, I absolutely agree with knighthood and chivalry. That's also something that I have a huge interest in. I did one of my essays in Literatures and Times on that. But also, King Arthur and Robin Hood are stories from that era that really got me interested in the history.
We're going to touch on those.
That's another reason. Yeah, we'll definitely get to that.
One thing that I would find interesting about that era, I don't think that would be one of my choices personally. Medieval era is just a bit too grim for me usually. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I do find interesting is the courts and the court intrigue and like if you could just watch the goings on and like, you know, a way where you saw all of it and you could follow the whole, you know, Machiavellian style, you know.
But you can do that. You can do that for any single historical period in like the Middle Ages. So
yes, but the court culture back then specifically appeals to me.
Yeah,
you know Ian Mortimer, who wrote The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England and The Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England. He wrote a book called Intrigue, and it's all about the court intrigue. I think you're going to love that book.
Yeah, fair enough. But if again on the question of reenactments, if any of you have ever had a chance to wear armor. You would know that thing is incredibly fucking heavy.
I avoid dressing up in any way possible, so I've never been to a reenactment.
But I've actually done it, and it's quite hefty. It's actually like you're sweating in there. It's heavy. You have to have a great body shape to be able to maintain that armor and to fight in that. I have no idea how they did it. Like I would just go, as Joe mentioned, if I was like an omnipotent not tangible being to just like see how it is and experience it. I would definitely go there just to see how they fought in those things, because from my personal experience in like the 21st century, wearing armor is absolute pain. It is absolute pain.
I'd imagine most people wouldn't last long in battle wearing those.
No. I mean, that's the thing. I certainly
most people wouldn't last long in day-to-day life during that
that's
period.
True. That's true. Then again, most people, I mean, you'd have to be a wealthy knight to be able to afford armor, I'm guessing. And good armor, at least. But so if you were a peasant, you were probably wearing, like, leather mail or whatever. Leather tunics, right. So you weren't really that protected. You're just going to battle and then you die in seconds or minutes.
And that's another thing
kill the first metal man you see and steal his metal soul.
That's another thing about
yeah. Just like RPG games.
Like the knights were very influential because of the way they looked and because of the property they owned. Obviously, if you were a knight back in the medieval period, you didn't just own a horse and some armor. You also owned the lands. You also had I forgot the word. I think it's called retainers. You also had retainers, which was basically like your own little individual private army, which in case of war or like conflict, when the king calls you, you in turn call your retainers to fight for you. So again, the more status you have as a knight, the more retainers you have, the more wealth. So for the common person, seeing a knight in shining armor, it's almost like seeing a celebrity these days, you know?
I think weren't knights paid £20 per annum back then? I think that might have been one of the King Edwards.
Which was a lot of money compared to what it is now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When I was younger, I was very interested in joining, the Society of Creative Anachronism, which is the reenactment society. Unfortunately, I never really got into it because I couldn't find it. I'm sure there was a local chapter where I was living back then, and I didn't find anyone else who was interested at the time. But I used to do GCSE drama, where I used to dress up a lot as medieval characters because we had freedom to do whatever we wanted. And that's about it. That's the extent of my reenactment goes.
Okay, I think I want to take it next and say a period I would very much enjoy going back to, and that is, I think both of you will agree with me even on this one, it's the Renaissance. I would love 100%. To go back and witness just the entire period from, like, if I could be omniscient and see all of it, everything everyone, like, important was up to. Especially, like, I wish I could witness some of the creations of the art and technology and things that carried over and that, like, caused a whole new era of advancement.
Just to interrupt you, you're talking about the Italian Renaissance, right? Because obviously in England it was quite a dire situation during those years, but the Italian Renaissance, okay?
Yeah, specifically, Italy and the Vatican and around that part of the world. Yeah. And just seeing, these incredible artists that we know the names of to this day who created,
the Ninja Turtles.
Sculptures. The Ninja Turtles. Yes, you stole my joke, Joe. You stole my joke. I was just about to say the Ninja Turtles.
That would be the first era I would go to immediately. Just the culture and the colorfulness of it, and just the amount of, like, that there is to see. It's not like you're going there for a single specific thing like it was with Knights and Chivalry. There's so much going on in Renaissance Italy at the time, from the trading that's opening up, from the new people that are coming in, to the technology being created, to the art being pumped out, to, the Vatican commissioning stuff, like the incredible, tapestries and the incredible, like, paintings on the walls of the basilica. It's just... It is so much. There is so much going on.
Very fun fact, before the pandemic actually started this year, we were planning on going to Florence. But obviously,
really?
We can't obviously do that this year, but Florence has been like a destination of mine and my family for that very reason in particular. It's a absolutely amazing Renaissance hub for what it is. It's still incredibly authentic. The small streets, the buildings, everything. Its entire history, man, as an Italian state before everything else happened. It's a destination which I would absolutely love to go in, and I would absolutely love to go in that period. And I actually have an exact event I would like to witness. And that is the construction of the Duomo. Like, if you guys don't know, the Duomo is like this huge, massive cathedral, which was like the highest building at its time in the world. It's pretty much the equivalent to, I would say, our St. Paul, in a way. Mm-hmm. It's a very nice religious building. It's huge. The construction of the roof.
It's like the French Notre Dame, same thing. Yes, absolutely. That big, ultimate, like...
The ultimate cathedral kind of thing. And it was actually commissioned by, I believe... Lorenzo Medici the Senior.
Yes, it was Medici the
Senior. And he obviously... The Medici, he obviously constructed it. And at the time, the dome itself, which gives the name the Duomo, was not completed, and no one knew how to complete the dome. And in comes Lorenzo, and he's just like, drops them a few money bags, and he's like, do what you must, this will be completed under my reign while I'm still alive, and people are going to remember me until forever. Like, and here we are talking on a podcast about Lorenzo de' Medici constructing the Duomo in Florence. But I absolutely agree with you, man. I would love to see the Renaissance. I would like to meet Da Vinci and all the other artists of the time. And
I mean, you know that I'm a massive, like, architecture, mark. I love architecture. It's what I talked about in the London episode. It's like the architecture that existed and was being, like, made at that point in time. My God. Like, we know these places now as places people visit just for the architecture. Venice, Florence.
Untouchable.
The Vatican. The entire Vatican. The whole thing. Like, that kind of architecture, even seeing it now, way past its, prime, it's like, oh, God, this place looks incredible. So if I could go back then and, see it near its conception when it was new and it was, like, fully maintained, that would be mind-blowing.
But obviously it's not all just... the good things in history, as we all know. Florence was quite a tumultuous state, to say the least, with a lot of regime changes in very short amount of time.
That only adds to the fun, seeing an omniscient being.
What's a few political conspiracies, man? What's a few murdered Medici? What's
exactly?
If
I'm strolling down the road and I see someone stab someone, I'm like, this is history I'm witnessing.
Oh, look, Lorenzo de' Medici is getting stabbed. Nice. you know. But again, Renaissance, absolutely amazing. Again, I'm sorry to say, I got into the Renaissance because of video games, much like Joe with medieval stuff in Total War. Assassin's Creed 2, if the real G's know, you know.
The real G's know.
The real
Assassin's
G's.
Creed 2 is great.
Here-
just because of that. Just because of the setting.
Here I am with a history degree, and I started my passion in history with Assassin's Creed. So academics, eat your heart out.
Tell us what your
Anyways.
lecturer said the first day you went into your history degree.
I think I've covered this, but the very first time I went to an open day, and I sat down, and the lecturer said, right, this is serious history business. If you're here because of Assassin's Creed or other mediums like that, it's not the place for you. And I just like to tell you, here I am, old man. The future is now.
The future is now, old man.
The future is now, old man. But yes. Yeah.
One of the things I love about the Renaissance is how many artists had patrons, and they could just find patronages easily.
Mhm.
And just do whatever they had the freedom, creative freedom to do whatever they wanted, like Leonardo da Vinci.
That's
and so
part
on.
of the reason there was such a boom, isn't it? Because
Exactly.
the artists were getting support, the kind of support that only then could you create, like the long form of art that they were creating, where it would take months or years to make something as crazy as some of the things that came out of that time period.
That's right. And speaking of which, if any of you listeners out there would like to support us, we might set up a Patreon page at some point. Just putting it out there.
Yes, let's usher in the new Renaissance by
The new
by supporting struggling artists like ourselves. But you know,
We
you
will
guys
call it the Faffing Renaissance.
Yes.
Faffing Renaissance. I like the sound there, you know. I like the sound there. But again, that's another reason I'm very glad you mentioned it, because that's exactly what Lorenzo Medici did with the Duomo. Like, he sponsored all these people to get it done, and it got done. Like, simple as. Just what else? Obviously, some of the literature that came out of the period, I think, is important to touch on. Biggest example we have is, again, we already mentioned the tumultuous period of Florence and the relationships the Medici have with one particular text, which I imagine both of you know, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli.
I've read it one too many times.
Yes,
frankly.
we can all
Machiavelli.
talk about The Prince for quite a while, and I imagine that if people want to, we can obviously talk about The Prince in more detail down the line. But I want to know you guys' thoughts on The Prince and why it is still a significant read today.
I mean, I think it's Machiavelli had a clear idea of like political machinations and what they do and how they work from like a really early point, and that part of humanity has never changed. So the way people scheme and try and, you know, rule, and what makes a good ruler and a bad one, or an efficient one and an inefficient one, that stayed a constant no matter how far technology, you know, has advanced. So no matter how far we come as a civilization, the Prince continues to be relevant, because you can look at it and be like, this all still applies. If I follow this guidebook pretty much, I can probably think of myself as a better ruler than someone who's never even heard of it before.
Exactly.
100%.
With Machiavelli, the reason, right? Okay, so this is going to sound bad, but I got into Machiavelli right at in politics A level. I started reading him then, and I was like, yeah, this is cool, but I wasn't so interested in him until I'm going to come back to this a lot of times in the future. Until I started reading Game of Thrones, and I realized how Varys and Littlefinger and Illyria and Tywin are all basically some version of the Prince. Right, it's as if they had their own unwritten The Prince in that world, and I thought, okay, I got to take this more seriously. And I just read Machiavelli much more seriously, and I realized, okay, this guy knew what he was talking about. You know, there's a lot of things that, like Lawrence said, apply today, with a lot of you know, you name it, how to govern the state, how to influence people, and so on. There's even I've got a book. It's called The New Machiavelli. I've forgotten who's written it, but it's basically Machiavelli adapted for the modern day. But I don't think it needs to be adapted for the modern day.
No, I don't think so.
Exactly, yeah.
And I firmly believe, and this is going to be a hot take, I'm going to say it out here. I firmly believe that the publication of The Prince is one of the most significant events in world history. Like, it's up there with any powerful thing that you can imagine. It's up there with the splitting of the English Church. In terms of impacts, I feel that the establishment of the Prince and the ideologies which it has brought forth, whatever they may be, largely negative. If you know, no one's gonna come out and just say we support Machiavellianism. We are Machiavellian. No one's gonna come out and say that because of the connotation that word carries. But I think in terms of how to rule and how to operate, it has been so deeply ingrained in the minds of everyone in the world that in some way, shape, or form, they believe in Machiavellianism. It's when you go down to the pub and someone tells you, oh, all politicians are the same. They all do the same thing. They're just self-serving. That is Machiavellian. As Joe mentioned, you go and read Game of Thrones. You go watch an anime. You go watch something where a character is self-serving and ambitious and incredibly motivated. That, at its core, is Machiavellian. So I think that the publication of The Prince not only established that whole idea about politicians and the ruling class, but it also opened up a plethora of new roads to go into about characters, about development, about just human belief into the forces that govern them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's funny how Machiavelli, if I'm not wrong, wrote The Prince when he was in prison, right?
Yes, he was being incredibly tortured. Like, he was tortured. Fingers twisted tortured.
Yeah, so not only did he knew what he was talking about because he was a diplomat from Florence, he was writing it as like a love letter to Borgia, wasn't he? To Cesare Borgia.
It was to Lorenzo Medici.
Was it to Medici? Oh, my bad.
Yeah. It was because he had fallen out of favor with them, and
right.
The idea was that with the publication of The Prince, he would get back in favor with the Medici. That's why it's addressed to the most honorable Lorenzo Medici. You know.
And did he get back into favor?
I can't really remember. I don't think he got back to the status he was before, but he stopped being tortured, which was, I guess,
which was
yeah, I think that's a step up. I don't.
It's a very big step
Absolutely.
up. Yes.
What do you say, Ivaylo? What era or time would you very much like to go see?
Well, to move away from the Renaissance and to move a bit chronologically, after the Renaissance, we approach the period which I am most versed in, and the period that I did most of my studies on, the early modern period. So, for those of you that don't know, the early modern period is usually believed to have began around the end of the 1400s. So 1485 to be exact. And Joe can interject here and actually talk about one of his favorite periods if he wants, which is the War of the Roses, if he wants to do that.
Yes.
So, and then I'll pick it up again from there. So, Joe, if you want to go.
Right, okay, so I grew up in Yorkshire, so naturally I was a Yorkist from a young age. I remember back in primary school, they sorted us into houses, and each one was named after a dynasty. So we had the Plantagenets, we had Windsor, we had Stuart, and we had one I can't remember. I really can't remember which one that was. Anyway, so I got sorted into Plantagenet. So I, from a young age, it was put into my mind that you live in Yorkshire, you grew up in Yorkshire, you're a Yorkist. You don't like the Lancastrians, you hate them. So, I mean, not really, but you know what I mean. So from a young age, I was fascinated by the War of Roses because I can't remember which teacher it was, but I think in primary school, someone covered the War of the Roses very briefly and very censored for kids. But immediately I was fascinated. I wanted to learn more about it, and I was curious how one family could split in two, essentially, and then fight over with each other for the crown, for the ultimate power in the country. And then that interest grew into my favorite play being Richard III, William Shakespeare's Richard III.
Good play.
Because of a very good play, in my opinion, because of how rhetorically well that is written. I don't mean in that it's persuasive for the reader. I think the way Richard's character is formulated to be this deformed being who all he has is the power of his tongue more than anything, and the power of his mind, and he can scheme, bring down the downfall of his brothers, eventually become king, try to solidify his hold, but then ultimately in the end be usurped by Henry VII, who actually happens to be one of my favorite kings of all time, because now Lawrence is going to give me some criticism for this, because not only was he a good steward, a good manager and administrator, but he was a very good accountant. I think he filled the coffers of the country, the treasury, to the brim before Henry VIII came and spent it all.
Yes. And I think a huge appeal of Richard III as a character, just to interrupt you a bit, was the fact that he is one of those characters that is just entirely comprised of monologues and soliloquies. And because of that, the audience feels a connect to it, because he's talking to them, and the audience is the only are the only people that actually know who the real Richard is, and that's another tremendous literary device. But again, we're going off tangent into literature instead of history.
My apologies.
Again, no worries. You obviously mentioned the beginning of Henry VII's reign, the first issue, the king, and that's where we come back to my period, which is where the early modern period starts. 1485, Battle of Bosworth. The forces of Richard III are pretty much just decimated by Henry VII, who kills Richard in the battlefields at the Battle of Bosworth, and finally ends the Wars of the Roses and unites the families by marrying Elizabeth. So finally the Wars of the Roses are done, and then we begin the early modern periods. And just people think that the War of the Roses was the worst thing that happened. I actually believe that the early modern period is quite more tragic, but I'll talk about that more later. But, just to make another Game of Thrones allegory, as this podcast is known to do many times, I firmly want to believe that Henry VII just killed Richard with a huge warhammer to the chest.
Right, so you think Henry VII
I want to believe that. I just smacked him in the face.
You think Robert Baratheon is based on Henry VII?
In a way, I definitely think the Battle of the Tridents is based on the Battle of Bosworth. If you want to make that allegory, it's definitely something that I would just 100%
Yeah, you know what? That's
correct.
interesting.
Ivaylo, you've completely stepped around what it is about the early modern period that you picked to go back to see.
I'm setting up the context. But I guess you said how you want to go to the medieval period because of the court politics. I want to go to the early modern period for the same reason, because I think they're far more advanced, and I think we get the beginning of what the legal system and what the judiciary and what politics currently is. Like, we see the origins of what we currently have in the early modern period with Thomas Cromwell, with all the political figures. If you guys want to talk about it more, you can go ahead, because I don't want to be hogging up all the time about how much I love the early modern period, but go on. What do you guys like about the early modern period?
For me, again, it's the court intrigue continues, and you have these different countries and the politics between them. I love the relationship between Portugal and Britain and France, and how they constantly butt heads, across this entire historical era, and how they constantly screw each other over and go to ridiculous lengths just to mess with each other, pretty much. They go to war and make alliances and blow them off, almost like the way we make plans to go outside and meet up,
Yes.
It's one day we're friends, best buddies,
Yes.
we're related,
England,
you and me.
England
England and France,
war.
yay. And then it's nope, next day we're at war, I hate you all, you're terrible. Stop eating frogs.
There was one of my favorite events in the early modern period is called the Valley of the Cloth of Gold. If you guys don't know about that, it's Henry VIII, the amazing Henry VIII that he is. We all know and love him. Controversial figure, which we're going to talk about more in length. But Henry VIII meets up with the King of France, I believe Francis I, and they're both very young guns. They're in their 20s. They're all about who's the bigger man. Who's got the bigger dick. So the Valley of the Cloth of Gold is this whole congregation of both English and French just meeting up and basically having a huge festival. It was so much money was spent on that festival to have all the grandiose horses and all the grandiose wealth. It was just a completely hedonistic exhibition of gold and wealth by two countries. And then they went to war. So, it's absolutely fantastic to me. And,
Isn't that also the period where it was to show how manly you were, you'd show off your legs.
Your calves, your absolute calves.
Exactly.
Yes. That's the period where the calves were the most iconic thing about a man. That's why in every single Henry VIII painting you see, he was explicit that his calf muscles would be demonstrated immensely.
Very
absolutely hench, yeah. Which was quite funny because he actually suffered from a bad leg for most of his reign later on.
Yeah, and he also had gout later on,
he also had gout.
Yeah.
But
it was literally flexing on everyone.
Yes, the focus was absolutely on the calf muscles. 100%. Now, I know, Joe, as a Catholic, you probably have your opinions on Henry VIII. So
oh boy.
We have to touch upon it. We have to touch upon it. I don't want to talk about religion on this podcast.
Of course not.
If we're talking about it in the historical sense and the role that Henry VIII has played throughout history, I think we have to talk about that.
Okay, if I
I'd
may
say, to me, first, just quickly, what he did, I find incredibly funny and ballsy. I very much like that he literally just went, you won't let me do the thing I want to do. I swear to God, I'm leaving this entire continent's belief system and making my own. That is the most, I'm going to go make my own and we're going to have blackjack and hookers thing ever.
But it's a decision that ultimately determined the next 500 years of history. So,
right.
Yep.
I want to get into that if that's okay. So quickly, I'll mention that I remember some stuff. So I was in House Tudor, not Plantagenet. So the other house was called Tudor, and we went to this house called Bishop's House in Sheffield, and everything is intact. If you go inside the house, everything has been recreated to look almost exactly like what it looked 500 years ago. Right. So that's where it came from. So now the Catholic thing. Okay, so you could make the argument that Henry VIII kind of had no choice. That it was the most a logical thing to do for a king who needed a male heir to just divorce his wife and marry another. But we all know how Henry VIII's history went. The irony is that his daughter, Mary, by Catherine of Aragon, became queen right after Edward VI.
Yes, good old Bloody Mary.
Yes, so the irony is that all of this effort that Henry went to, the first Brexit that the UK had by leaving the Catholic Church, right? All of this effort, for about 50 years after his reign, was pretty much for naught, because you first had Mary, and then she was overthrown, and then you had Elizabeth. So he was trying to get a male heir, but the irony is that the best monarch after him for about the next 50 years was his daughter Elizabeth. So if he had just been content with Mary, it would have been everything would have worked out fine for Henry.
But see, I raise you because Elizabeth is Anne Boleyn's daughter.
I know that. But I'm saying, but you see, the thing is, his whole thing was that he needed a male heir. But
Well, you can argue that, but it was probably also just, I don't like this woman. She's older than me, way older by 20 years, and I just want someone else because I'm in love with someone else. I think the heir thing was obviously a logical explanation he gave, especially to the Pope when he was asking for the annulments.
Yeah.
But I think it was very much also, I'm Henry, I'm young, I'm a king, I can have anyone I want.
Absolutely.
I do not want to be stuck with someone I don't want.
But I think he also wanted the money from the monasteries. Otherwise, why dissolve them, right? So there was the economic incentive.
Yeah, I was just about to mention how the fact that he separated from the Roman Church not only gave him the woman he apparently loved to the moon and back, but also made him insanely rich. I believe through the dissolution of the monasteries, he actually pretty much filled up the coffers to what they were prior to him ascending to the throne. So obviously that did not come without its repercussions. Dissolution of the monasteries caused one of the greatest uprisings in early modern England in 1536 with the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was a massive religious effort by Catholics in the north of England who rebelled. And another reason why I would love to live in the early modern period is because it was a period full of rebellions because of Henry's decision. Because of that decision, all the rebellions that happens, I am absolutely on board to go in there and seeing them. I don't want to participate in them because they all failed and the ringleaders were all tortured and executed in horrible ways. But stuff like the Pilgrimage of Grace, it's absolutely amazing. And again, consequence of that religious decision.
See, the thing is, I know that you're interested about the England or the UK's relationship with continental Europe throughout history, right?
Yes.
And it's funny that at some point, one of the Plantagenet princes became the Holy Roman Emperor. So that for a period, Europe, mainland Europe, had a Norman/English emperor, which is very funny to me. But then obviously it reverted back. See, the thing is, I think this is my personal opinion, if Mary wasn't forced to marry Philip II for the power, she could have, I mean, we don't know. Maybe Mary ended up never having an heir, right? So
yes, the what if episode isn't happening.
Well, isn't happening, right?
Yeah,
but the what did happen was that without England separating from the Catholic Church, perhaps Scotland would have never unified through the Stuarts with England, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to ask you guys, do you guys have any favorite historical figure from that period?
From that period?
Yes.
I mean, for me, it is either Henry, because I love how much of an actual Chad he was.
Fair.
Everything he did is hilarious to me in context. Every time I read about him, I was like, obviously, other than the beheading his wife's part, that sucks ass. But everything else he did to like the continent, to Europe, everything he did in spite of the church every time someone said no to him. It is like watching a grown man baby have the best tantrum ever.
Thank God we've never seen that.
It is just hilarious.
What about, can you tell me anything about Sir Francis Drake, Lawrence?
Oh, God. What do you want me to say about Sir Francis Drake?
Well,
he was an explorer. Sick.
Well, he's one of my favorite characters. I mean...
Yeah, I know. Go on, then. This isn't my favorite period. I don't care.
I mean, Sir Francis
Did he not
Drake,
write New Atlantis, Ivaylo?
I don't think he found New Atlantis. I'm
Not
sure.
found. He wrote. It's a novel that he wrote. I think.
I believe so. Yes, I believe so too. I'm not entirely sure, but Francis Drake, obviously, amazing explorer. He's the second person to circumvent.
Oh, my
the
bad.
globe.
My bad. Excuse me. I'm thinking of Francis Bacon. You're thinking of Francis Drake.
Yeah, you have a terrible memory, Joe.
I do. I'm sorry, everyone.
No worries. Anyway, Sir Francis Drake, amazing historical figure, one of the most well-renowned Elizabethan sailors, tremendous explorer. Also, I'm not praising him too much because he was a bit of an asshole as well. But in terms of what he achieved about naval sailing and about everything, all that, amazing character. If I'm allowed to say, my favorite early modern person is this one man called Cardinal Campagio. Joe, do you know? Do you know about? Okay, so we all know about Cardinal Campagio. So yes. Cardinal Campagio was the man sent by Rome to England to negotiate Henry VIII's separation and divorce. Yeah. And watching the Brexit negotiations these days, and having watched them for the past 4 years, and comparing it to Cardinal Campagio, it's pretty much the exact same thing. Because Rome purposely went and found the most crippled, sickly old man to lead.
And he also had gout,
and
right?
he also had gout.
Yeah.
So, and keep in mind, there's no planes back then. If you travel from Rome to England, you're traveling in a slow-ass pace. So Campeggio takes 6 months to go back, to go to Rome, then to go back to England, to negotiate, all the while being sick, old, and miserable, going back to Rome, going back to England, each trip taking about 6 months, and then going back and telling Henry no.
Gout hurt more if there was movement and vibrations, like your bones would feel like they were exploding.
Right.
So Campeggio's in his little carriage, being carted around, and it's just like every single bump in that road,
Constant
every journey
pain.
Back and forth from the Vatican to England, Campeggio's legs are just exploding under him, and he's like, "Why have you chosen me?"
It is the trolliest move in political history, in my opinion, because of that negotiation. But yes, okay, I think I've said enough about the early modern periods. I can go on and on and on.
I'll just say who my favorite figure is from that period, and then we can probably move on. Obviously, it behooves me that you did not mention Walter Raleigh or Edmund Blackadder. I'm kidding. But my favorite favorite figure rather, has to be Thomas More. Because
of course. I knew this was coming, Mr. I wrote Utopia. It had to be.
Of course
Utopia is good. Utopia is good.
It is good. It is good. But also because, he had everything to lose by rejecting the new Church of England and rejecting Henry VIII. And yet he gave it up anyway.
Also really close friends with Henry, so that was a hard choice to make.
Exactly.
He was like a son to him, Henry,
That's right.
From what historical context tells us.
That's right.
But go on, Joe, explain. Talk about Thomas More.
Well, I mean, Thomas More really is a Renaissance man. I mean, he knew a lot of languages. He wrote literature. He was a very good advisor to the king, even though the king didn't see it from time to time. And I think he ended up saying something along the lines of, "I die for my country, but for God first," or something like that. Yeah. When he got beheaded. And he becomes a saint. I think he's this patron saint of politicians today and lawyers.
Yeah, and it's quite ironic because Henry VIII was actually awarded title Defender of the Faith in the 1520s, and Thomas More was immensely proud of that. So it's quite disgusting that
the dramatic irony of being able to look back upon that.
Irony, and it probably was quite hurtful for Thomas More, the fact that you saw this young man that you've raised just turn around and just... I
mean, hey, potatoes. Thomas More burned like 100 people because they were heretics.
That is true, yes.
That is true.
Can I just say, we all know people in these periods were all horrible in comparison to today. Like, we all know this, we understand. We're looking at them as strictly historical figures and their impact, you know?
Yeah.
We're not trying to cancel Thomas More, okay?
No, we're not being...
No,
we're not,
I've already cancelled him when I read Utopia.
We've already cancelled Thomas More. He got burned at the stake. You can't cancel a man more than that. Don't forget. But yes, I think it's about time we move on from the early modern period, because if I stay here, I'm going to bore the audience with my knowledge.
Yeah, I want to grab it next, and this is a very specific thing I'm going to say. So, one of the things I'm very interested in is going back to see times of conflict that are vastly different to our own. So, a few of the periods I would love to get to see are the Crusades and the Napoleonic Wars.
Fair.
Now, personally, I've, just like Joe mentioned way earlier, played a lot of Total War games since I was young, right? But the version of war we have now in the modern world is very different from what war once was. And I can't even, in my mind, really, no one probably can, fathom the idea of an army of 60,000 men going up against an army of comparable size on a field in the open. You know, just coming at each other. So I want to see stuff like that because I can't comprehend it. I can't comprehend armies the size of the ones we had in the Crusades, where what was it? The Crusade, the sack of Constantinople was what, 30,000 Crusaders or more? Sacking one giant city, like just the size of these movements and the way they were mobilized and had to be supplied. All of this is so fascinating. And you don't really see it in that same way anymore in war. You know, war now is segmented. It's smaller squads and squadrons moving in different areas. And even, you know, the world wars weren't like that after a point. After the trenches, it wasn't really just throw lines of people at each other except for places like Stalingrad. So yeah, I want to see these battles and these conflicts that must have looked like nothing we've ever witnessed, you know, since. Yeah, they're horrible, but they're also fascinating because seeing armies that size maneuver and use formations and, you know, close in on each other, things like that, it's mind-blowing to think about. It would be so fascinating to see with your own eyes.
Yeah, I agree with that. The closest we ever come, like, on screen to that is either Kingdom of Heaven, where you have Orlando Bloom fighting in the Crusades, and also you guys have seen Oliver Stone's Alexander, where the battle in the desert, where he's got his pikemen, his organized pikemen, and then you've got the Persians who are all like this disorganized band of people. But it is crazy, you're right. What also fascinates me, just like you, is the logistics of the battle. It is like how the heck do you supply an army that big?
Yeah, think of how you give orders, how much everything has to work for anything to happen in those wars. Like, you're the general at the back of 50,000 people in front of you going to war. Back enough that you're safe, and you have to have these runners go back and forth and relay orders to generals in different parts of this formation and keep all this running at the same time. It must have been the most insane juggling act we can ever imagine. No modern, you know, instant communication, no tech maps or like satellite views. It would have been something to witness.
Absolutely. And all you needed was one false rumor that, oh, your king has fallen, and then a lot of the soldiers would just rout. They'll just rout, and then
precisely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, other than the sack of Constantinople, there's like two battles specifically that historically I wish I had seen with my own eyes. First is the Battle of Cannae.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the one where, Carthage went to war against Rome, and then like 10,000 Carthaginians killed 50,000 Romans under the command of Hannibal Barca.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, which is one of my favorite historical figures ever. Mr. I came across the mountains with my elephants. Yeah. Beware Romans.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that battle was, imagine that, just 10,000 Carthaginians beating 50,000 Romans by using an encircling tactic formation and just crushing them, closing in on them. It's so incredible. Even thinking about it, you can't really imagine what that would have looked like on a real field.
I agree with that. You mentioned...
Yeah, you go first, Joe. I'll continue.
You mentioned tactics, right? So, if I'm not wrong, the battles with Hannibal is where Fabian came up with Fabian tactics, which was he kept retreating, and then he kept bringing Hannibal or the army further into the land basically the terrain that they could more easily fight in, right? So you mentioned logistics and tactics. These are fascinating things because back then it would have been so raw compared to, like you said, modern warfare.
Yep. And the other battle, quickly before we move on from this, the Battle of Leipzig, which is when Napoleon had his biggest defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. It was when he fought off Austria, Prussia, and Russia at the same time.
Yeah.
And it was like a total of 84,000 or something men on the field in its entirety, all three armies together. Can you even imagine what that must have looked like? Three, of the biggest powers at the time going head to head in a single location, and just, I can't even imagine it. It must have been one of the craziest, most horrifying sights to behold.
So you want to go experience just the battles, right? You want to go and experience.
Yeah,
that.
I want to see them from like a bird's eye view. I want to be able to see the whole thing play out.
If I'm allowed to say something about battles before we move on, again, I'm not so much familiar with the Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that, but I love how all the historical battles that we've touched upon, and largely in the early modern periods, I feel like the individual played a larger role than the individual plays today. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people who fought in those battles were under direct command over someone who had wealth and who had status. These people fought for their king, literally shoulder to shoulder with their king or shoulder to shoulder with their retainer. To once again mention the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth was decided by one man, and that man was not Henry or Richard. I mean, obviously the battle ended for the Tudors when Henry killed Richard, but the battle was actually decided by a man called Sir William Stanley. Now, William Stanley held the name the Kingmaker because whichever Yorkist king or Lancaster king sided with him usually won that battle. And in the Battle of Bosworth, it was unknown until the very last minute on which side William Stanley would fight on. And he obviously, as history has it, William Stanley and his troops join Henry, and they absolutely destroy Richard. But again, that's the individual's decision, and him having all that wealth, power, and all those retainers. I feel like it's way more a battle of individuals than it's a battle of current, armies and stuff like that. Because, again, you mentioned absolute chaos. You mentioned absolute chaos, and how do you command it? I just think that you get a few individuals, and they just hurl and play lives.
And I mean, think about it this way. There's a reason we know these, historical
that's why we know them.
Figures of, Hannibal Barca, Napoleon. Yeah. They were strategists of the kind you don't really know anymore. Yeah. You don't know many modern generals, their names, or who they are, because there's so many, moving cogs and parts to the strategy the armies come up with, nowadays in wars or conflicts. But back then, a single man's plan could literally shape history for the next 100 years.
Absolutely.
Another period I'd love to go to, just since we're going into it anyway, and we're flying by like this, the Sengoku era in Japan, right?
Oh, no.
Back when there were samurai and daimyos, and it was this big clustered, different little kingdoms inside Japan. Everyone knows the name Oda Nobunaga, right? The legendary Nobunaga. And he was known as the first unifier, because that was his thing. I'm going to unify Japan, and I'm going to beat literally everyone. All the tiny kingdoms and warlords and other daimyos, I'm going to crush them. And some of the tactics he developed and some of the historical battles he's known for, when you go and read up on them, it's this man was a master of battle. He was a genius tactician. He did certain things that, no one would have come up with, really, ever at the time. And you can see, this is why even now we know of this random daimyo from the Sengoku era. Because this one person alone made so much difference with every tactic and choice and, thing he chose to do. It's so crazy to me. And we see it less and less, I feel, in the modern world, where it's more we know certain figures, but we only know them because they're celebrities or stars. They're not really known for... Most of them aren't known for doing some great thing or achieving some great objective. You know what I mean? Can
you guys imagine Boris Johnson fighting alongside an army? Can you imagine that? Just good old Boris with with an M16 just running in dangerous areas. And
I think he'd be an enthusiastic commander or soldier given his personality, for sure.
But he would be the first one to get shot. So, let's not kid ourselves. Like,
they'd see his bright hair and just be like, target spotted.
Target spotted. But again, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think we no longer have. And again, it's an incredible morale. Like, if you're fighting beside your king or beside your ruler, like, it's
I agree.
Make it or break it. Like, you make it or break it because, that's why Henry VIII wanted to be seen as a warrior king for that very reason.
I think fighting as a commander with your army is, especially back then, it's different now because you have generals doing that for you, not so much political leaders. But back then, it was a very important trait to have as a good king, because if you're not going to fight for your people, why should they fight for you?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. So
yeah, I mean, we see that nowadays where it's like, the people in power don't fight, and we constantly see like soldiers completely demoralized or like disgusted at the hierarchy, and like these politicians send us to die, and they do absolutely nothing. They're in no danger. They just sit at home.
Not to mention some of
watch us on the satellites.
Not to mention some of the deplorable treatment of people who do come back from wars.
Yeah, the veterans.
Exactly.
People who suffer from PTSD, which is a real thing.
Yeah, it's a completely different dynamic then, because if you were at war with your leader, then if it went wrong for him then at the moment as well.
Yeah, he loses as well.
You wouldn't you wouldn't be like, you died and he hasn't suffered anything. No, it would be, you're watching this dude get destroyed alongside you, and it's like, at least we're both here, right? We're fighting.
Right. Right, yeah. You touched upon the great unifiers. I wanted to talk about that because while your favorite is Oda Nobunaga, and he's a great unifier, he's a great historical figure, my favorite happens to be Ieyasu Tokugawa, who was his adopted son, right? So, so I've got 3 quotes from the 3 great unifiers.
I'm so glad you've continued this.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if anyone would be able to continue with Sengoku.
Of course, I love Sengoku Jidai. So here are the 3 quotes, and I'll say what they said, and I'll tell you why I like Ieyasu. So Oda Nobunaga was the first unifier, and he said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will kill you." And Hideyoshi,
my kind of man.
Hideyoshi Toyomoti, right, in response said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I'll make you sing." And then Ieyasu Tokugawa said, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I'll wait for you to sing." And I think that really demonstrates what kind of a leader or politician he was. He didn't play with force. He waited. He played the long game. And then eventually, once Nobunaga and Hideyoshi were dead, then...
By the way, anyone who doesn't know how Nobunaga died, it's the most badass bullshit ever. Go look it up.
Go look it up, yeah.
Like, he supposedly, fought off 100 men before they killed him.
I don't actually know about his death, so...
There's some historical Chad beyond measure.
Absolutely.
Ambushed, fought off 100 men, finally died. Hell yeah, dude.
That's right.
Wow.
And then Ieyasu rises up through the ranks and becomes the shogun for about 50 years. And I think for about 300 years, his clan were the de facto rulers of Japan.
I think they rule up until the Meiji Restoration.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's my bit on Japan.
But I mean, I also love the culture in all these, right? Obviously I'm saying, let's go see the battles, but also all of the places I've named, obviously the culture during the Crusades, seeing all these different places, Constantinople, seeing, the Middle East back then when it was in its, golden age, arguably, of civilization. Seeing all these different places, it must have been so incredible to see them, seeing the samurai era and the way Japan used to look back then. We pretty much romanticize it now constantly in media and stuff. And we see
I don't know what you're talking about.
We see it in the Kurosawa films, we see it in games, we see it in everything that comes out of Japan. But imagine seeing the land back then, and it's the beauty of it, and just these temples, these Buddhist monasteries, stuff like that. Oh, it must have been so...
It must have been amazing.
Just incredible to see, yeah.
So we've all touched upon, historical stuff. What about modern history? Do we have any modern historians in the room? Any modern historians?
I mean, I know a lot about, arguably, modern-ish history,
because
but it never feels like I'd go back to see it. You know what I mean? That's not...
Exactly. I'm not really... I don't think it's something that really appeals to us, because...
Yeah, one thing I think is interesting and would have been cool to see, I guess, is a few of, the things that happened in the Soviet bloc, which is, both our countries were sort of dragged in and made a part of.
See, I actually know a lot about that, so I don't need to see it.
Yeah.
But,
Obviously, seeing the Berlin Wall fall, that must have been an interesting sensation if you're there to see it, right? That must have been monumental to the person that was there to witness it.
Yeah. But again, stuff I don't know, stuff in the last century, I feel like it hasn't really been presented in the same light that, for example, Japan or like early modern England.
Well,
or like
this brings me to something that's actually really important that I wanted to bring up, and you've made this like the perfect point. I find a problem with modern history is now that we're so good at recording it and recording what
we're
happens,
taking away the charm.
There is no mysticism. There's no myth to it anymore. It's not like this, whoa, imagine if, because turn on some black and white footage and you can see the dudes in the trenches getting gunned down. It doesn't have the what if anymore. You don't think to yourself, wow, if only I could see this, or if only I could envision it. We have footage of the Soviet Union. We have footage of all this stuff that's happened since the Cold War, infinite libraries of footage and like surviving footage of Vietnam, of everything. We don't feel the same wonderment at history that's that close because we've had it recorded so well that there's nothing really mythical about it. And one of the things that I want to talk about in relation to that is, think of the Three Kingdoms in Japan, right? That era. Yeah. It is pretty much barely, if at all, recorded properly. All of it is like passed on stories, more or less, right? It's mythology, more or less. It's history because we don't have an alternative history to China, but it's also sort of mythological. You don't know if any of these warlords were even really real. Like all these warlords that were at each other in the Three Kingdoms period and all that incredible history, it could be pure myth. And that adds so much to the wonder factor of it,
Absolutely.
Think of all the sites that don't exist anymore. The Great Colossus of Rhodes,
Oh my god, don't get me started on the ancient wonders.
The Hanging Gardens.
Do not get
stuff
me
like that.
Oh.
Think of like the wonderment of like history that's that far away. Even the Roman Empire and like
It's
back when the Library of Alexandria existed and the
Yeah.
Lighthouse of Alexandria and the pyramids were in their prime.
Yeah.
All of this to us is so fascinating and so
Because
wondrous
we don't
because
have much of it. Yeah.
there's nothing. We can't see it. There's no like record from back then that we can look into, right? We can't see footage of like when Caesar marched into Egypt.
Yeah.
Like things like this are just like, to us, they're mythical. But because modern history is so, 24-hour news cycle these days, you think any of what's happening currently in the world is going to be mythologized at all when we can see these bumbling idiots every day
Not at all.
fuck things
Not
up
at
when
all.
they're ruling and constantly ruling
I do
everything.
actually feel sorry
It's-
for the next generation because they're going to have
Yeah,
all
no,
this.
it's impossible,
But
right? Like,
on-
you can't even have that.
To play devil's advocate, and this is quite idealistic on my behalf, but
Mhm.
I think because we have better records now and because we have better understanding of what came before, maybe people in the future will not make the same mistakes.
Oh, yeah, no, I think it's also
Maybe.
easier to hold people to account.
Yeah.
Like, you can't really hold people in the past to account because, like,
'Cause-
oh, you committed atrocities that no one covered or recorded or passed the info about? Well, I guess we don't know about
Yeah,
those.
exactly. And, people still to this day, there are some incredible people who still just don't believe in the atrocities committed, and I can't fathom that level of stupidity sometimes. People who
And, like, we're witnessing some, like, history being made right now, obviously.
Oh, yeah,
as we've been
we're living-
alive. There's a lot of things that's happened, but to us, they're never going to have the wonder of, like,
no.
the stuff we've discussed this episode. These, like, incredible periods, these events that are, like, unfathomable in scale.
That's the irony of it as well, because for people living back then, they wouldn't have said they were living remarkable.
Everything now is
Yeah,
like
right.
absolute magic.
Yeah,
like if you
right.
brought someone from the Renaissance now, their head would like close
Explode.
in on itself and they turn into a black hole and the whole world would be sucked in. Like
Absolutely. Oh man, history, man.
See, we're all. I think what it is that we're all now the three-eyed raven, aren't we? We all have the same
Yeah.
collective memory.
Enough with the Game of Thrones jokes. God damn.
God damn. See, the thing is, I think you're right. With older history, which wasn't as so meticulously recorded, we can have different interpretations. We can have different historiographies. You mentioned great man history, right? So focusing on single figures and stuff like that. So we can have that sort of historiography, but with modern day period, it becomes, I think, less and less clear what sort of historiography we're gonna interpret the modern period with. And so you're right, it loses the allure, and that's why I prefer losing myself into anything from the Victorian period all the way to the past, because of course we've all studied the Cold War and stuff like that, and we're arguably either still stuck in some sort of a Cold War or we've entered a new one. So it's not really interesting, because we're kind of living through it again. But stuff like the Golden Age of Piracy, to name one, or the rise of Christianity, as difficult as it was. Like, as a Christian, I probably wouldn't want to go back and see Christ doing his ministry, because that would defeat the purpose of me having faith, right? So,
Yeah, I understand.
but the Holy Roman Empire and how that developed.
But again, it's part of like the mythological wonder of it too, right? Like, you don't want to see certain things because there's no wonder to it then.
Exactly.
Like, it really does carry. And like the whole, Age of Piracy, you mentioned, yo ho ho, pirate's life for me. Let's go there for a bit. We would love it because of the way we've mythologized piracy, especially.
Yes, but
where
these
it's like, it's
people are
about
criminal
freedom
scumbags.
and principles and like, exactly. And it's to us, it's this wonderful thing because it's like, look at these crazy people that just took to the sea and started fighting governments and winning for a while. You know what I mean? Almost going toe to toe with like the British Navy and French Navy and the Portuguese Navy.
The East Indian
and
Company.
building the civilization. Exactly. And you've got like this incredible, and to us, it seems, in that light that we've turned it into in media especially, pirates are fucking cool, right?
Yeah.
But if you went there and like sailing and existing on a boat and living that
Miserable.
lifestyle sucked ass.
Miserable.
Exactly.
Miserable
Yeah,
stuff.
I don't want to get scurvy. Thank you very much.
You would stink so badly, your beard would be full of vice, you would be a miserable human being, and you would be a criminal.
Imagine being on a ship for like over 50 days because you're just sailing and you haven't gone to port yet. Like, that would be horrifying for us now in the modern day.
Yeah. A lot of people still do that today, by the way.
Yeah, I know, but like, again, you get my point. It's like, in those conditions, being stuck on a ship during that time, I'd
go
rather
crazy.
not,
Plus, there's no mystery anymore because everything's been discovered in the world. So you're not gonna just stumble on a new island, find a new continent,
Right.
But
But yeah, no, ideologically, the Age of Piracy is amazing, and like in that sense, in that concept, I do love it, and I would want to see parts of it. Like, I like that even that age where we, think back to it and we're like, it's actually very miserable and shitty. It still has these characters that are like mythological to us at this point. Blackbeard, who supposedly got stabbed 7 times and shot 12 times before he died in his final battle.
Yeah.
All these other captains that we know by name, Vane, Kid, all these incredible personages. And it's the same with the Wild West. We know that it would be like terrible to live in the Wild West. It wasn't like a Western the way we envision it, where it's like, you're a gunslinger and it's cool.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah,
you're getting like scalped by Apaches or you're getting shot by another gang. Like,
it's disgusting. Yeah,
it's not fun, but we have these like historical figures, right? They're mythological.
A lot of history is mythology. That's an underlying factor of it. A lot of history is mythology, but I absolutely love history. I think knowing history is knowing yourself and knowing the world you currently live in. I believe that it is a necessary study for everyone to learn a bit of history just to know where they're going. Like, you can't know the future if you ignore the past. That, for me, is absolutely accurate. And history doesn't often repeat. It often rhymes, however. To say that, to quote my good friend Joe, he actually told me that quote.
I didn't come up with it, though.
I know you didn't come up with it, but you're the one who uses it all the time.
Yeah.
But, again, I feel that, like, history is an essential part of human nature and humankind, and it's the eye of it's the eye of the world, man. History is the eye of the world. Those who do not know history, those who don't study history, are doomed to repeat it. Simple as.
Imagine, I had a point, right, where I thought back. I was like just chilling in pandemic land, not doing much. And I thought back to it and I was like, what was it like for me before I learned about the history of the world? When I thought back to like, what has the world been like the last however many years? What did it look like in my brain if I had...
I don't remember.
Before I learned about... It's weird, isn't it? Was I at a point, like, thinking nothing if I thought back? Was there nothing when I thought back, like 1,000 or 100 or 20,000? Would it just be, like, blank? Because that's so weird to me. If you don't have this context to, like, how the world got to where it is, how do you even envision the world in your head? How does the trade and the politics and the way the continents are laid out, everything, how does any of that make sense to you anymore?
Exactly.
That is interesting. And, it's funny you say that because it reminds me of how I thought about history beforehand. Because when I was in year 3, about 7 or 8, I thought that the world had only existed for about 1,000 years. I didn't know any better. So the world was really small to me. And we went on this trip and we found this fossil. And then I remember our head teacher said that this fossil is so many millions of years old. And I was like, what? Like, I had a mind blown moment then. And that's when I realized, obviously, I had a lot of blank spaces to fill in. But that's when I realized that there's much more to history. There's a lot more context that I don't know. And I will always be at that point where I'll never know enough, right? So there's that thing.
Yeah, I love the way you described it, blank spaces to fill. That's absolutely how it was. Like, after I got interested into history, I was just like, start filling in the blanks. What do I not have any clue about? Why does history look so weird in my head?
Exactly.
There's an interesting Platonic and Aristotelian questions, aren't there? Because Socrates says, the thing he knows for certain is that he knows nothing. And I think it was either Plato or Aristotle or one of their contemporaries who said that we know everything. It's in our subconscious memory. We're just relearning it or something along those lines. So there are interesting historical and philosophical questions to ponder on. But I think it won't be for this episode. We'll probably leave it for another one.
I think that's a great place to end this. I'm absolutely happy that you guys sat down and talked history with me. I'm an absolute history buff. I do have a degree in it. I hope, for those listening, I wasn't too much of a fool, and I hope you guys were entertained by some of my history knowledge. But,
Yeah, and I hope maybe some of the people listening have gotten more interested in the subject.
Yeah, if you
a lot of
want
people
us to do
really
more,
write it off. Yeah.
Yeah, history is not something to be written off at all. Like, it has a bad rep for being a humanities subject, but if you're doing at least one humanities subject, do history. It's very rewarding. It's very freeing to know what came before you and how it's shaping up your current life and how you can shape up the future.
So quickly, since you mentioned that, right? So a lot of the whole romanticization and mythology that comes from history is because the chroniclers who were writing history at the time had some freedom to enter in some myths. Like, for example, you think of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes literature as though it's history, right? For example, or you talked about how history rhymes. It'd be interesting for another episode to think about: does the age of exploration and age of discovery and age of expansion is going to repeat itself when we finally land on Mars and stuff like that?
I mean, even didn't George R. Martin? It's not super Game of Thrones, but it's related.
Mm-hmm.
He released a book that's literally the history of Westeros.
That's right.
Like Blood and Fire.
The World of Ice and Fire. And Fire and Blood, yeah.
He wrote it in such a way where it is a historical record, and it's written in such a way where it is literally telling you, do not trust everything I've written here.
Yes.
Because this is written by characters in this world, by historians in my fictional world. So some of it is not fact. Some of it is embellished. Some of it is changed ever so slightly. And it's like, that's such a fascinating way to show that concept off.
That's
You've
right.
raised a very good point, which again we're going to leave for another episode. The fabrication and the impact and the power of history. I think that it's something that should be mentioned as well. He who controls history controls the present, in my opinion.
Yes, and then the victor
writes history, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. If there is interest, we will do some more history podcasts.
Please let us know in the comments, and I am going to make a
some
poll.
More history stuff. We can do a what if scenario coinciding with the Marvel release of the series What If.
Oh yes,
we can do a
very
similar thing.
Very good point.
Unfortunately, we're not on Disney Plus yet, but we're aiming to get there one day. So
you guys, we'll start the Patreon first in reference to our great Renaissance period, and then we're going to end up on Disney
maybe
Plus.
One day we'll end up on
the
Disney
terrible
Plus.
modern period.
Yes. Okay,
and I'll make a poll for everyone. You can choose which period you want us to cover next. There we go.
Thank you. I'm
fun.
very happy with my two students. They are all A-star students.
Thank you, Sensei.
You will both make. I'm saying this not because you're just my friends, but if you guys did want to ever go into history, you would make great historians.
Thank you.
So class dismissed. This has been Ivaylo
and Lawrence,
and this has been Joe.
Goodbye.
See you next time.
Bye.